And now we move on to the next speaker, Professor Christina Bergh from Sahlgrenska in Sweden, who will talk about single embryo transfer.
Hello everybody. First, thank the organizers for inviting me to this very nice meeting, I think, with excellent lectures the whole morning. Thank you. So, the title of this presentation is Single Embryo Transfer, Expectation and Reality. And I thought first, what shall I say about single embryo transfers 20 years after introduction? But I have, well, I first know nothing to disclose. I've organized this lecture like this. First, I tell you a short background, and then I try to answer 3 questions. Why should we do single embryo transfer? How does it work? Why not single embryo transfer? And something about future. The background first, art is increasing, we all know that, and now it's more than 7 million children born around the world, and more than, in some countries, more than 6% of the national cohorts are born after art. It's 60,000 children in Sweden. This is the latest graph about multiple births in Europe and in USA. And as you see, it's still quite high rates of multiple birth, around 20%, a little more in the US as expected. Most are twins, but there are also triplets. This is anyhow the development of single embryo transfer in Europe. And it's the blue line you can follow from 97. And of course it has increased, but it's still quite modest, I must say, around 30% today. It's, however, very varying in different countries in Europe. So this slide shows delivery rate, that's the blue bars. And the green bars are the multiple birth rate, and the red bars are the single embryo transfer rate. And on the left, you see the Scandinavian countries. In Sweden, the single embryo transfer rate is around 8%. And you see the corresponding low multiple birth rate, now below 4%. And in the other end is Albania with extremely low single embryo transfer rate, a couple of percent. The thing which does not vary so much is the delivery rate, which in most countries is somewhere 20–25%. So there's no correlation there. So why then should we transfer one embryo? What's the evidence behind that, actually? I think I have to go back to some old data. This is one of the first studies, I think, which really showed us what do IVF do to the children, how does it affect children concerning preterm birth and low birth weight, etc. And this is a registered study from Sweden. You see it's the year 82, all from IVF started up to 95. It was then 6,000 IVF children born compared to 1 million children born after spontaneous conception. The multiple birth rate at that time point in Sweden was, after art, 26%. And we found, as expected, that the pink bars are the art children and the blue the spontaneous. And you see that there's a huge difference in outcome, both for low birth weight and for preterm babies, with adjusted odds ratio around 6–7. So 6–7 higher risk for the IVF children to be born preterm. If one turned just to singletons, because these were all children, you see a similar pattern concerning low birth weight, etc. But now the bars are double. It's the double rate compared to the spontaneous conceived singletons. So instead of showing you a lot of studies, I've summarized the risks for being a twin baby compared to be born in a singleton. And there are risks both for the mothers but particularly for the children, with overall increased risk for being born preterm, very preterm, low birth weight, mortality, etc., and also severe sequelae. If we think about cerebral parese, mental retardation, etc. And these risks are increased by a factor between 5 and 10. So it's huge differences. This study is a Swedish register study again, and it's some years ago. And we did this study because there was a debate at that time that twins do as good as singletons, so why bother? People want twins, that was the argument as well. And so we compared mothers who had delivered twins. It was around 2,000 compared to mothers who had delivered 2 singletons, because most families maybe want 2 babies. So how does that affect the outcome? And again, you see the huge increased risk for the twin babies compared to the singletons, whatever you measure. And if you measure neonatal diseases, because maybe that's the most important, it might not matter so much if you are born some preterm, but it's the neonatal diseases and the sequelae that matters. But these were also increased by a factor around 5. Cerebral parese is one of the most severe neonatal outcomes. This is an old meta-analysis. It's 10 years old. It includes 3 studies all from Scandinavia. And at that time point, the risk for the IVF children was about doubled if you compared all children, but it was also increased for the singletons. Here were the absolute risk for the singletons compared to the twins. A more later study, which is in fact the largest study in the world, who has investigated cerebral parese, comes from Sweden. It includes just about 30,000 IVF children and more than 2 million controls. And the first line, which I've underlined here, is the risk if you compare all IVF to all spontaneous, and then the adjusted odds ratio here is around 2. But if you check for the singletons, it's no longer significant, which means that most of these over-risks are due to the multiple birth babies. And I put the absolute risks here to the left, 0.28 for singletons and 0.80 for the twins. And of course, one can say that in absolute numbers, this is low, but for the parents who get these severe damaged or severe diseased children, then it's a reality, I think. Another study, which actually is about the same years and the same population, published in JAMA a few years ago, checked for autism and mental retardation. And the only thing they found was this with mental retardation, which was increased for all IVF children, but not for the singletons. Risks then on a little longer term, we don't know so much about that yet. There are coming studies for long-term outcome for the IVF children, but they are not really there yet. But there are can go for this Bergh hypothesis, which concerns starving in utero. If you are born growth retarded or preterm, there are higher risk in adult life to have cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, hypertonia, and stroke. And as I said, there are not so much, at least not large studies concerning little older children yet, but anyhow, there has been some studies and an update a few years ago from Bob Norman, and one had found some increased risk of high blood pressure and higher glucose level in the IVF children. So how does it work? Sirpa Vilska from Finland was the first group who showed us that single embryo transfer in fact works and gives satisfactory pregnancy rates. That's almost 20 years ago. After that, there has been published several observational studies, and all these, I can say, showed that you got similar live birth rates after single embryo transfer as after double embryo transfer. But that's, of course, depending on that more good prognosis women got one embryo back, while less good prognosis women got 2 embryos back. So if you instead go to the randomized trials, there were in these days around 6 randomized trials published, and they showed a little different picture. You got higher, significantly higher live birth rates after having transferred 2 embryos if you just compare 1 embryo versus 2 embryo. This was put together in a meta-analysis by all authors, and so you see that the live birth rate when transferring 2 is in fact 50% higher compared to a single embryo transfer. But that's when you only compare the fresh transfers. If you instead add a cryopreserved embryo in the single embryo group, as we did in the Scandinavian trial, we end up with quite similar live birth rates, and what you earn is this dramatic decrease in multiple birth rates. And just a slide from this largest study, where this cumulative live birth rate in the single embryo group, 1 fresh plus 1 cryopreserved if you didn't got a child after the first fresh transfer, compared to a double embryo transfer, yielded these live birth rates, and as I said, this dramatic difference in twins. And this was reflected, of course, in the outcome for the children, with a 5-6 times higher risk for being born preterm for the double embryo group and low birth weight. We also, 5 years later, collected data from all these cycles, 5 years, because that's according to the law in Sweden, that you can have the embryos cryopreserved for 5 years. So we collected the data after 5 years and found out how many women had got a child after this single ovum pickup. And so this is the randomized trial, the additional cryo cycles, and that ended up with this cumulative live birth rate and the same pattern with the multiple birth rate. And calculated per woman, it was quite similar figures, the number of patients who got a child. So this is randomized trials. How is it in reality? This is the Swedish graph, because 20 years ago, it was a lot of discussion, a lot of worries when these large observational studies arrived with this high risk for the children. So it went almost to a law, or I would say the step just below the law, that we were only allowed to transfer 1 embryo in a majority of IVF cycles. It's not as strict as a law, I will point out. So you are allowed to transfer 2, which I think is good. You should never be fanatic. Anyhow, that was accepted both from IVF clinics, both private and public units, and also from patients very well, more well than I ever had thought. And this happened here somewhere. And the yellow is the delivery rate, which you see have stayed very constant at just below 30% per cycle. And here is the single embryo transfer rate, which increased at that time point and now is around 80%. And the dramatic decrease in the multiple birth rate from 25%, which we had as well as other countries, and down now to 4% or below 4%. I mentioned that also singletons, one have to say that also singletons have an adverse outcome compared to singletons from spontaneous conception, even if that is much, the risk is much lower compared to the multiples. Here are some meta-analyses. There's been a huge number of studies investigating this, but here are some meta-analyses, and I think the good with this anyhow is that if you look at the last one, the odds ratio are lower compared to earlier meta-analyses. So instead of 2 to 3 times higher risk for the children for preterm birth, etc., it has decreased to 1.5, 1.7, which is encouraging. And we have a Nordic group who work together, and we wondered in this update paper, why is it so that singletons have an adverse outcome compared to singleton from spontaneous conception? We hypothesized these things. Is it the hormonal stimulation? Is it the IVF procedure? Is it cryopreservation? The culture media, can that affect it? The embryo culture time or the number of embryos transferred? And what we did found out was that subfertility per se, even if you don't do IVF, do affect the preterm birth rate, and so does IVF. So IVF is an additional risk factor to the subfertility. Hormonal stimulation also. If something is a protective factor, it's a lower risk for being born preterm if you do an extracycle compared to a standard IVF. And the same for cryopreserved embryos. Nothing, we could found no difference for blastocyst transfer, and we also saw this with sibling analysis. I don't know if you know what sibling analysis is. It's when one woman delivers one child by spontaneous conception and another child by IVF. And then you sort of have the same mother, which is good for reducing bias. But then again, the IVF children do worse. This is an encouraging study, which I'm very proud of, and it got a lot of media attention, I remember. It's also from this Nordic group, and here we looked for trends. So how does this have this, if you look at the earlier cohorts and compared to the later cohorts, you can see, for example, for being born preterm, the blue straight line are the IVF children, and here is the spontaneous singletons. And you see that it has taken place a decrease, a quite dramatic decrease in being born preterm for the IVF singletons if you compare the 80s to the cohort 20 years later. And the same pattern is in fact true for being a small for gestational age baby or for death. So there has been a trend towards a better outcome for the IVF singletons. We don't know. We got the question, of course, from the media, what does this depend on? What do you do to make it better? But I don't think we have an answer to that. It's, they are less infertile, the women, in the Scandinavian countries. I remember when we started, it was 6-7 years waiting list, and now there are in more, it's a year maybe, or a couple of years. But so there is a difference. But I don't think we have the answer to that good development. So then we come to more little disappointing arguments. Why not set? Yeah, first I think many people, they still look, what do they think when we talk about twins? Well, they don't think about very preterm and deceased children, of course. They have this in their mind. Neighbors or a sister or something which had delivered twins with 2 healthy babies, a nice chance to have 2 babies at the same time to make up for lost time. And this attitude was in fact supported by some doctors, particularly in the US, which said that twin pregnancy, contrary to all evidence, is a desirable outcome. You don't need to care about the risk, etc. So this attitude was supported by that. And they don't realize this, of course. Again, a study from Anya, where one saw this huge increase for the twins compared to the singletons of being born also very preterm, which of course is the more severe risk. I think we have to realize that IVF today is an industry. It's a big business. IVF clinics, they compete, and the competing tools are high pregnancy and high delivery rates. And as we know, you get some higher delivery rates by transferring 2. If you just compare 1 cycle, that's what they used to compete with. And they don't realize, or they ignore or whatever, that the risks are there. And unfortunately, it's also money, which I think is disappointing, that money has taken such a big place in art nowadays. So what shall we do? What are the future strategies? Cryopreservation has been going on for a long time, but there are now new methods, new techniques, which show that the birth rates, they are increasing, and mostly after cryopreserved embryos nowadays. This is from the Swedish quality register again, and the cryopreserved cycles are the pink line. And you can see that these are ICSI standard IVF, and you can see that the live birth rate per cryopreserved cycle is increasing, and it's in fact now almost exactly the same as for fresh embryos. And there are other advantages with cryopreserved embryos. I touched upon this, and there are in fact better obstetric, better neonatal outcome with a lower risk to being born preterm. But also some other, this again from this Nordic group with collaborating, and the cryo babies are the red bars, and you can see there are somewhere in between the singletons from the spontaneous conception and singletons from a fresh transfer. So there's a mid risk for being born preterm. But then we found something else which has not been found before, and that was that there were more big babies, more heavy babies after cryopreservation as well. So you see that's large for gestational age, and more than 4.5 kilo, which is increased for the cryo babies, both compared to fresh singletons from fresh transfer and compared to singletons from spontaneous conception. We don't know so much today about what is the risk of being big, being heavy. Research has more focused on growth retarded babies and preterm babies, but during delivery anyhow there are risks of asphyxia, scoliosis, hypoglycemia, etc. for big babies. There are also risks, we have heard this before, about preeclampsia, which has been confirmed from other countries as well. Not very big risk, but anyhow a statistically significant increased risk for the cryo pregnancies for the mothers then, both from several studies. What's new in this area is this freeze-all studies, where there now has been published 3 large randomized trials. It's 2 from China and 1 from Vietnam. This first was from China, and there it was in PCO women, and so they compared one cryopreserved ET versus one fresh ET, and you see that the live birth rate is in fact higher in the cryopreserved group. And it's quite huge study. A similar from the next Chinese study. Here it's ovulatory woman, and you see this huge study, more than 2,000 women randomized. But here it's similar live birth rates in the 2 groups. And also in the third, which is from Vietnam, it's also ovulatory women, and similar live birth rates. Next, how is blastocyst transfer an option? This is a Cochrane review, and just comparing just comparing blastocyst versus cleavage rate for 1 cycle, and then the winner is blastocyst transfer. If we go to cumulative live birth rate, they have divided this in slow freezing. Then there is an advantage for cleavage, and in the only study, just 1 study published yet, where it's vitrified blastocysts, which is the way we do it today. And then there was an advantage in cumulative live birth rate for blastocyst transfer. Here is the overall in this meta-analysis. There has been some concern about the blastocyst transfer and the baby outcome, the children outcome, that it should be more higher risk for being born preterm. In this update paper, 1.3 odds ratio, but a later study, also from Sweden, showed that this didn't seem to be the case. There are no statistics here, but in fact, there were no difference in any of these outcomes. This paper particularly focused on birth defects, where one also had found a higher risk in the blastocyst transfer, which of course has raised a lot of concern. That's something that always raised concern, birth defects, but we didn't find that either, so it was quite similar. That's just the statistics there for the birth defects, which you see don't differ. For the maternal outcome, there are also some data that seem to be some more placenta complication, which is a little difficult to explain, I think, but you see the risks are, I mean, if you compare to the spontaneous conception, is about 10 times the risk of a placenta previa. And that's seen in these statistics as well. So there are, could it be a way to stimulation? That's an old area again, which we have been doing several strategies during the last years. But some 10 years ago, it was, what shall I say, modern with mild stimulation, and we were told that it's no idea to go for more than 8-10 oocyte because it flattens, it's even out the delivery rate. This picture is from the Swedish registry again. It includes 77,000 fresh cycles and 30,000 additional cryocycles, adding cryocycles. So just check the cumulative live birth rate, which sort of put the number of oocytes retrieved to around 18 instead of these 10. So it seems that you can get more deliveries, more children by having some more, picking out some more eggs. The newest thing, we have not talked so much about that yet, but maybe it will come later. That's time lapse and this big, what shall I call it, industry, which has this advertisement promising us higher live birth rates by using time lapse. But I think the evidence is quite limited. It was this Spanish study which showed higher live birth rates, but that has not been confirmed in later studies and not in a Cochrane analysis either. And just a very recent study concerning time lapse. It's just published on the web yet. It's from China as well. A little strange, maybe a randomization. They randomized day 3 plus time lapse versus day 5 and conventional morphology. And they did this as a non-inferiority. They designed it as a non-inferiority trial and assumed a 70% ongoing pregnancy rate in the control arm and accepted a minus 10% non-inferiority limit. But what happened was that the day 5 transfer was the winner, and with conventional morphology. So they could not declare non-inferiority for this new technique. Last slide concerns PGS, which it's also a long story and done a lot with a lot of money involved. And it's quite few studies, quite few small studies, and only in good prognosis women which has shown a benefit, and most later studies has in fact been negative. So just sum it up a little, the strategies, what we have to deal with is cryopreservation, which I think is coming strategy, blastocyst transfer, maybe stimulation strategies. Legal regulation, of course, it's a way to go, and reimbursement system, and also children follow-up, because I think that's what we are dealing with in our Nordic group. A little later with diabetes, puberty development, etc., and also school performances. So if we can show that the singleton and term babies do better, I think that's a good argument for the parents, because they always want the best for their children. Thank you.